What's in the bag, Grandma? A knitting kit? Some hard candy for the long march. The voice belonged to Cadet Sergeant Miller, a man whose chin was permanently tilted upward, as if constantly trying to get a better look at his own imagined halo. His question, sharp and dripping with condescension, sliced through the anxious quiet of the pre-deployment staging area. A ripple of snickering spread through the assembled company of West Point's finest, young men and women sculpted by ambition and polished by institutional pride. They were the future, the sharp end of the spear, and they knew it. The crowd laughed, a nervous, pack-animal sound that affirmed Miller's dominance. They stood in rigid formation, their new multicam uniforms crisp, their state-of-the-art packs bulging with precisely issued gear. And then there was her. She stood slightly apart, a quiet island in a sea of restless energy. Her uniform, though clean, was softened with wear, the pattern faded over the knees and elbows. Her pack was an older model, its fabric worn to a dull sheen in places. She didn't react. Her gaze remained fixed on the horizon, her expression as neutral as the gray sky above. She didn't flinch, didn't sigh, didn't offer the slightest twitch of annoyance. This absolute stillness, this placid refusal to engage, was more infuriating to Miller than any retort could have been. He saw only the silver streaks in her tightly bound hair. He saw only the faint lines etched around her eyes. He saw only an interloper, a special entry candidate far older than the rest of them, someone who had clearly slipped through the cracks of their rigorous system. To him, she was an anomaly, an error in the code of excellence. He took her silence as weakness, her age as infirmity. Striding forward, he gestured to his two corporals. "Let's see it. Standard gear inspection. We can't have any non-regulation sentimentality holding us back." They hesitated for a half-second, a flicker of institutional training warring with the primal urge to follow their pack leader, before they obeyed. They unclipped her pack and emptied its contents onto a dusty poncho liner with a theatrical flourish. The expected items were there: rations, water purification tabs, a med kit. But the cadets zeroed in on the oddities. There was no high-speed GPS unit with satellite link-up. Instead, there was a heavy, brass-cased instrument that looked like a 19th century surveyor's tool. There wasn't a state-of-the-art, vacuum-sealed trauma kit, but a simple canvas roll filled with what looked like handmade bandages and oddly shaped surgical tools. And tucked in a side pocket was a small, worn leather-bound book, its pages filled with handwritten notes and complex astronomical charts. Miller picked up the brass instrument, its weight surprising him. "What is this, a steampunk compass? Are you planning to navigate by the stars if your iPhone dies?" More laughter, louder this time. The joke had landed. The woman finally lowered her gaze from the horizon and looked at the scattered contents of her life's work. She said nothing. Her silence was a vacuum, and the cadets rushed to fill it with their own noise, their own assumptions. But when the academy superintendent, Captain Eva Rostova, a woman whose own legend was whispered in the halls of the Pentagon, rounded the corner of the barracks, her eyes didn't see an old woman being mocked. Her gaze swept past the cocksure cadets, past the sneering face of Miller, and landed on the woman's stance. It was a subtle thing, a detail lost on the untrained eye. The way her feet were planted, perfectly balanced. The way her shoulders were relaxed, yet ready. The way her hands, resting at her sides, were not clenched in anger, but held with the placid grace of a surgeon or a bomb disposal expert. Rostova stopped dead in her tracks. A ghost of a memory flickered in her mind, a story she had heard a decade ago from a grizzled Delta Force operator in a dusty Afghan bar, a story about a phantom figure they called the Weaver, a master of unconventional warfare who could navigate by the Earth's magnetic fields and stitch a man back together by moonlight. The captain's face, normally a mask of stern authority, went pale. She took a half-step forward, her mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came out. The cadets, noticing the shift in atmosphere, fell silent. The air grew thick with unspoken questions. If you believe that true strength doesn't need to announce itself, type competence below. The scene was a tableau of youthful arrogance, a masterclass in prejudice delivered by boys and girls playing at being soldiers. Miller, emboldened by his audience, held up the small canvas roll. "And what's this? Planning on doing some sewing? Maybe darn some socks for us when we make camp." He unfurled it, revealing the strange, gleaming instruments inside. They were not for sewing. They were hemostats, forceps, bone saws, and suture needles of a design none of them had ever seen before. They were compact, brutally efficient, and worn with the kind of patina that only comes from repeated, desperate use. The cadets stared, their laughter dying in their throats. The tools were unsettling. They spoke not of regulation issue, but of grim necessity. They were the instruments of someone who had operated far from the clean, well-lit world of a military hospital, someone who had worked in the dark, in the mud, with nothing but their hands and their will. The woman, whose name they had not even bothered to learn, finally spoke. Her voice was low and even devoid of any emotion. "That is my personal kit. Please put it back." The request was so simple, so devoid of challenge, that it almost broke the spell. But Miller, too far down the path of public humiliation to retreat, doubled down. "Your personal kit?" he sneered, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this is the United States Military Academy. We use standardized equipment. We don't bring our hobbies from home. Whatever you did in your previous life, it doesn't apply here. Here, you're a cadet. Nothing more." He gestured grandly to the surrounding environment, to the immaculate barracks, the perfectly manicured lawns, the towering monuments to past victories. "This is West Point. We have standards. We have protocols. We are a system of excellence. Your little bag of tricks and your antique Star Charter are a liability. They represent a failure to integrate, a failure to trust the system." His words were a sermon, a declaration of faith in the institution that had shaped him. To the other cadets, it sounded like leadership. It sounded like the voice of a future officer. They nodded in solemn agreement, their own insecurities momentarily soothed by Miller's certainty. But the woman's eyes were not on Miller. They were on her equipment, scattered in the dust. There was a story in every worn piece of gear. The brass navigational tool had been a gift from a Bedouin guide in the Rub al-Khali, a man who taught her how to read the dunes as a map. The handwritten book of astronomical charts was a copy she had made herself from a lost manuscript in a monastery in the Himalayas, its calculations corrected for polar shift. The surgical tools were designed by her, forged by a master craftsman in Damascus before the war, each one perfectly balanced for her hands. These were not hobbies. They were extensions of her soul, instruments of a lifetime spent in the shadows. In the places on the map mark, here be dragons, they were the tools of a quiet professional, someone whose entire existence was a testament to the fact that the system, for all its excellence, could not be everywhere. Sometimes the system failed. Sometimes the radio went dead, the GPS was jammed, the medevac couldn't fly. And in those moments, all a soldier had was what was in their head and what was in their pack. Her silence was not weakness. It was the patience of a predator, the calm of a master who knew the storm was coming and that, soon enough, all this noise would be drowned out by the scream of reality. She slowly, methodically began to kneel, not in supplication, but with the deliberate grace of someone preparing for a complex task. She reached for the first piece of her scattered gear, her movements economical and precise. She was not asking for permission. She was simply beginning the task of restoring her world to order, an act that was, in itself, a profound statement of defiance. The air crackled with the tension of what was to come. The world broke. It happened without warning, a sudden, violent tearing of the sky. The FTX, the field training exercise, was designed to be a grueling test of land navigation and small unit tactics through the unforgiving terrain of the Hudson Highlands. But the planners had accounted for rain, for fog, for the usual hardships of the wild. They had not accounted for a microburst, a meteorological sledgehammer that fell from the sky with the force of a bomb. One moment, the cadets were marching under a bruised, gray ceiling. The next, they were in a churning vortex of wind and water. Trees, old and defiant, bent, and then snapped with reports like cannon fire. The trail dissolved into a rushing, muddy torrent. The world became a maelstrom of noise and chaos. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the cadets' training. Their state-of-the-art comms crackled with static and then went dead. Their GPS units, searching for a satellite signal through the dense, electrically charged storm clouds, blinked uselessly. Shouts were snatched away by the wind. In less than 5 minutes, the company was scattered, disoriented, and effectively blind. Miller, his face pale and streaked with rain, tried to assert control. "Form on me. Sound off. Where's the platoon, Sergeant?" His voice, so full of booming confidence moments before, was now a thin, reedy thing against the roar of the storm. A falling branch, as thick as a man's thigh, crashed down just yards away, and the cadets scattered like quail. In the heart of the chaos, one figure remained a point of stillness. The woman. While the others were driven by instinct and fear, she was driven by an ingrained, almost cellular-level response to crisis. She didn't shout. She didn't run. She moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, her eyes scanning the chaos not with fear, but with an unnerving degree of analytical calm. She was reading the storm, feeling the shift in the wind, noting the direction of the water flow. She was gathering data. A young cadet, no older than 19, slipped on the slick mud and went down hard. A sickening crack echoed even over the wind. He screamed, a raw, piercing sound of pure agony. His lower leg was bent at an angle that defied nature. It was a compound fracture, ugly and severe. Blood began to stain his torn trousers, mixing with the brown, churning mud. The sight sent a fresh wave of panic through the group. The platoon medic, a cadet named Sanchez, fumbled with his regulation first aid kit, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't tear open the sterile packaging. This was not the neat, textbook injury from their training manuals. This was real, it was messy, and the boy was going into shock, his skin turning clammy and white. It was in that moment of collective paralysis that the woman acted. She moved to the injured cadet's side, her steps sure-footed on the treacherous ground. She knelt, ignoring the mud that soaked through her worn uniform. Her hands, which had so recently been the subject of mockery, went to work. From the canvas roll she had just repacked, she produced one of the strange, gleaming hemostats and clamped a severed artery with a speed and precision that was breathtaking. She took one look at the boy's terrified face. "Look at me," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through his pain and the storm's fury. "What is your name?" "Harris," he choked out, his eyes wide with fear. "Harris," she repeated, her tone holding not an ounce of pity, but a universe of calm authority. "I'm going to set the bone. It will hurt. You will scream, but you will not move." "Understood." He could only nod, mesmerized by the absolute certainty in her eyes. She then turned to the trembling medic. "Sanchez, I need pressure here, and I need you to find 2 straight, sturdy branches. About this long." She held her hands apart, defining the exact length. "And give me your cravats." All of them. The order was so clear, so direct, that it broke through his panic. He had a mission. He scrambled to obey. In the midst of the storm, under the terrified eyes of the future leaders of the American military, the old woman began to practice a forgotten art, a brutal battlefield medicine that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with survival. The scene that unfolded was a masterwork of quiet competence, a symphony of practiced motion against a backdrop of raw, elemental fury. While Cadet Miller was still trying to rally his scattered and terrified soldiers, yelling orders that were swallowed by the gale, the woman had created a small pocket of order in the heart of the chaos. She worked on Harris's leg with a focus that was absolute. Her hands moved with an economy and grace that was almost hypnotic. She took the branches Sanchez brought her and, using a small, razor-sharp blade from her kit, quickly stripped and notched them, fashioning a makeshift traction splint. This wasn't something from the standard Army first aid manual. This was a technique from a different, harder school. The other cadets, drawn by a morbid curiosity that overcame their fear, formed a loose, silent circle around her. They watched, mesmerized as she poured a small amount of clear liquid from an unmarked flask onto the wound. It wasn't regulation antiseptic. It smelled faintly of alcohol and herbs, a concoction that seemed more alchemy than medicine. Harris hissed in pain, but the woman's calm gaze held him fast. "Breathe," she commanded softly. "With me. In through the nose. Out through the mouth." She breathed with him, a slow, rhythmic cadence that seemed to impose its own calm on the frantic scene. Then, with the help of Sanchez, she applied traction. There was a wet, grating sound as the bone was pulled back into alignment. Harris let out a single, strangled scream that was quickly lost in the wind, his body arching in agony. But her grip was like iron, her voice a steady anchor. "Hold," she said to Sanchez. "Hold it steady." She then began to bind the splint to his leg, not with the issued Velcro straps, but with the triangular cravats she had collected, tying them off with a series of complex, interlocking knots they had never seen before. Each knot was pulled tight with a single, efficient jerk, creating a rigid structure that completely immobilized the limb. The whole procedure took less than 3 minutes. When she was finished, the bleeding had stopped. The leg was secure. The boy, though pale and sweating, was conscious and coherent. She had saved his leg and likely his life. The silence that fell over the small group was more profound than the roar of the storm. It was a silence of pure, unadulterated awe. They had just witnessed something impossible. They had seen a level of skill, of calm under fire, that they had only read about in the biographies of legendary soldiers. Their mockery, their cheap jokes about her age and her gear, now seemed like the ignorant babbling of children. Miller, who had finally stumbled over to see what was happening, stood frozen at the edge of the circle. His jaw was slack, his face a mask of disbelief. "No way," he whispered, the words barely audible. "That's not possible." He was looking at the knots she had tied. They were perfect. He was looking at the splint. It was textbook, yet better than any textbook he had ever studied. And he was looking at her hands, now stained with mud and blood, but as steady as the ancient rocks around them. The storm was already beginning to slacken, its fury spent. The wind died down to a mournful sigh, and the rain softened to a steady drizzle. In the sudden quiet, the only sounds were the dripping of water from the trees and the ragged breathing of the cadets. The woman rose slowly to her feet. She wiped her hands on her trousers, leaving dark smears on the faded camouflage. She looked around at the circle of young faces staring at her, their expressions a mixture of shock, shame, and a dawning, profound respect. She had not raised her voice. She had not boasted. She had not said, "I told you so." She had simply done the work. Her actions were the only refutation necessary. In the quiet aftermath of the crisis, her competence was a shout that deafened them all. The rhythmic thumping of rotor blades grew from a distant pulse to a deafening roar, tearing through the newly established quiet of the forest. A Black Hawk helicopter, stark and menacing against the bruised sky, appeared over the treetops, its searchlight cutting a brilliant white cone through the mist. It didn't land, but hovered with impossible stability 20 feet above a small, rocky clearing nearby, the rotor wash blasting the cadets with a cyclone of wind and water. A figure rappelled down a fast rope with the fluid efficiency of long practice. It was Captain Eva Rostova, the Academy superintendent. She landed lightly on her feet, unclipped from the rope, and immediately began striding towards the huddled group of cadets, her face a thundercloud of controlled fury. Her presence was an immediate and overwhelming assertion of authority. The cadets, including Miller, instinctively straightened up, their fear of the storm replaced by the more immediate fear of a commanding officer on the warpath. Rostova's eyes, sharp and analytical, took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. The scattered cadets, the fear and confusion on their faces, the injured boy lying on the ground, his leg expertly splinted, and the calm, unassuming woman standing beside him. She bypassed Miller completely, her gaze fixed on the woman. She walked directly to the injured cadet, knelt down, and examined the splint. Her gloved fingers traced the lines of the cravats, testing the tension of the knots. She ran a hand gently along the splinted leg, assessing the alignment. She looked at the boy's eyes, checking his pupils for signs of shock. A long, tense moment passed. Then, she looked up, her eyes meeting the woman's. There was no surprise in Rostova's expression, only a kind of grim confirmation. "The C7 knot," Rostova said, her voice low but carrying with absolute clarity. "Haven't seen that tied in the field since my first tour in the Kinner Valley." They called the man who taught it the ghost of the Pesh. She stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving the woman's face. A dawning realization was spreading across Rostova's features, connecting a dozen different data points, half-forgotten stories, and classified after-action reports into a single, terrifying conclusion. "What is your name, cadet?" she asked, the word cadet sounding strange and ill-fitting. The woman met her gaze. "Torne, Mom." Specialist Alara Thorne. Rostova's face went rigid. The name was a key, unlocking a door in her memory that had been sealed for years. She turned to her communications officer who had followed her down the rope. "Give me a priority check on a Specialist Alara Thorne." Authorization code, Rostov Alphaniner. The comms officer, sensing the urgency, quickly tapped on his wrist-mounted device. The air crackled with the faint sound of encrypted data transmission. The cadets watched, utterly bewildered. Miller looked as if the world had tilted on its axis. He had humiliated a specialist, a rank far below his own cadet sergeant stripes. But the captain's tone, the sheer gravity of the moment, suggested something was profoundly wrong with that assumption. The reply came back in a burst of digital text that only the captain and her officer could see. Rostova read the screen. Her posture, already ramrod straight, somehow became even more rigid. She took a deep breath. Then, in an act that sent a shockwave through the assembled cadets, Captain Eva Rostova, superintendent of the United States Military Academy at West Point, a war hero with 2 decades of command experience, drew herself up to her full height and executed a slow, perfect, formal salute to the quiet woman in the worn uniform. The gesture was so profound, so utterly contrary to the established order of things, that it seemed to stop time itself. The cadets stared, their mouths agape. Rostova held the salute, her eyes locked on Thorne. Then she spoke, her voice ringing with an authority that was absolute, a voice that was not just giving an order, but correcting a fundamental error in the universe. "Cadets," she boomed, her voice cutting through their stunned silence. "On your feet. Address this woman as ma'am." Specialist Thorne outranks every single person in this valley, myself included. The captain's words hung in the damp, heavy air, each one a hammer blow against the fragile foundations of the cadets' world. "She outranks all of us." The statement was a logical impossibility, a violation of every rule and regulation they had ever learned. Rank was everything. It was a visible, immutable hierarchy. Miller was a cadet sergeant. Rostova was a captain, an O3 on the fast track to major. Thorne was at best a specialist in E4. The math didn't work, but the salute was undeniable. A full bird captain does not salute a specialist. Not ever, unless the word specialist was a lie. Or, more accurately, a cover so deep that its very existence was a secret. Rostova held her salute, her arm a rigid bar of respect, until Thorne gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't a return salute. That would have broken her cover, but a quiet acceptance of the new reality. Only then did Rostova drop her hand. She turned to the circle of stunned, mud-streaked faces, her expression a cold, hard fury. "You fools," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You arrogant, ignorant children. You stand here in your clean uniforms, convinced of your own superiority because you passed a few exams and ran a few miles. You think you know what a soldier is. You know nothing." She pointed a trembling finger at Miller, who flinched as if struck. "You, Miller, you mocked her gear. You mocked her age. You presumed to inspect her belongings. Let me tell you what you were looking at." Rostova took a step closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, yet carrying whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. That steampunk compass you held in your hand? That's a custom-built, non-magnetic declinometer with a gyroscopic stabilizer. It can find true north in a steel-walled room, or during a solar flare that would turn your $30,000 GPS into a paperweight. There are only 3 of them in existence. The other 2 are in a vault at the NSA. She then gestured towards the splint on Harris's leg. That sewing kit. Those are instruments for deep field trauma surgery, designed by her for her. The techniques she just used to save Cadet Harris's life are not in your textbooks. They are taught in only one place on Earth, a classified medical program for Tier 1 operators at Fort Bragg. A program she designed, and for 10 years was the lead instructor of. The cadets were no longer just stunned. They were shrinking, physically diminishing under the weight of the revelation. Every word from the captain was a chisel, chipping away at their pride and revealing the soft, unformed ignorance beneath. Rostova wasn't finished. She paced back and forth like a caged lioness. Her file, she said, tapping her own temple. I just saw the highlights. It's a ghost record, mostly redactions. But the parts one can see. Unit classification, asymmetrical warfare group, special activities division. That the designation, so secret most generals don't know exists. It means she doesn't belong to a unit. She is the unit. They send her where the system breaks, where armies fail, where there is no backup. Combat hours? Unlisted because they stopped counting a decade ago. Medals? The list is a joke. A Distinguished Service Cross, 3 silver stars, a bronze star with a V for Valor Device, and a note that most of her commendations are classified above presidential daily briefing level. She finally stopped in front of the silent, stoic figure of Alara Thorne. You are standing in the presence of a living legend. A ghost. She is here, at this academy, under a deep cover assignment to evaluate our training protocols from the ground up, to see if what we teach here has any bearing on the realities of the modern battlefield. For the last 3 weeks, she has been quietly observing, testing, and taking notes. And what did you show her? You showed her that our future leaders are arrogant, undisciplined bullies who judge a warrior by the crease in their trousers and not the steel in their spine. Rostova turned her gaze back to the cadets, and the full force of her authority crashed down upon them. Specialist Alara Thorne is not a cadet. She is not your subordinate. She is your assessor, and you have failed her inspection. Miserably. The aftermath of the revelation was a deafening silence, broken only by the whine of the Black Hawk's turbines as it prepared to winch up the injured Cadet Harris. The world had been reordered. The cadets, who hours before had stood tall with the unshakable confidence of youth and privilege, now seemed small and lost. They avoided looking at each other. Most of all, they avoided looking at Specialist Thorne. To look at her now was to be confronted with the full, crushing weight of their own foolishness. She was no longer the strange old woman, the charity case. She was a monument, a walking embodiment of a level of experience and sacrifice they could barely comprehend. Her worn uniform was not a sign of poverty, but a testament to 1,000 missions they would never read about. Her silence was not weakness, but the profound calm of someone who had seen the worst of humanity and endured. The story of what happened in the Highlands spread, not like wildfire, but like a slow-moving, deeply penetrating shockwave. It wasn't shouted in the mess halls. It was whispered in the barracks late at night. It was shared in hushed, reverent tones between cadets in the libraries and training fields. The details became mythic. The steampunk compass became the compass of Thorne, an artifact that could find truth in a world of lies. The C7 knot she used on the splint became a secret test of character. Instructors would watch to see which cadets took the time to learn its complex form, seeing it as a sign of humility and a willingness to look beyond the approved curriculum. The phrase, getting your bag checked, took on a whole new meaning at West Point. It became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that true worth is not always visible, that the most dangerous person in the room is often the quietest. It was a verbal shorthand for the dangers of assumption and the virtue of humility. Cadet Miller, the architect of the humiliation, was subjected to a different kind of reckoning. He wasn't expelled. Captain Rostova, in a moment of what could only be described as inspired cruelty, decided that would be too easy. Instead, Miller was stripped of his cadet rank and assigned directly to Specialist Thorne for remedial leadership and character training. His punishment was to become her shadow. He carried her pack. He cleaned her gear. He stood by and watched as she taught other cadets the things that truly mattered. How to read a star chart, how to find water in dry country, how to treat a sucking chest wound with nothing but a ration wrapper and tape. He was forced to witness, day after day, the quiet, unassuming competence of the woman he had tried to destroy. The transformation was slow and painful. The arrogance was sandblasted away from him by the sheer, undeniable force of her expertise. He learned to listen. He learned to watch. One afternoon, weeks into his penance, he found her sitting alone by the river, cleaning the tools from her medical roll. He approached her hesitantly, his usual swagger completely gone. "Ma'am," he began, his voice barely a whisper. I was wrong. I was arrogant. And I am sorry." Elara Thorne didn't look up from her work. She continued to wipe down a gleaming steel forceps with a practiced, methodical motion. For a long moment, she said nothing, and Miller felt the familiar sting of being ignored. But then she spoke, her voice calm and even. "The first step in learning, Miller, is admitting you know nothing." She paused, then looked up at him, her eyes clear and direct. "The second step is to be useful. Hand me that oilcloth." He obeyed immediately, his movements quick and eager. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. It was a chance. In her quiet, professional way, she was not just a warrior or an assessor. She had become a teacher, and her most important lesson was being taught not with words, but with the humbling, irrefutable power of demonstrated worth. The legend of Specialist Elara Thorne became woven into the very fabric of the academy. Her story was no longer just gossip. It was institutional folklore, a foundational myth passed down from the senior class to the new plebes on their first day. Instructors used it as a teaching tool in ethics classes and leadership seminars. "Remember Thorne," they would say. "Look for the quiet professional. Don't be a Miller." The physical evidence of her time, there became relics. Cadet Harris, who made a full recovery thanks to her intervention, kept a small piece of the cravat she had used on his splint tucked into his wallet. He claimed it was a good luck charm, a reminder that the best help often comes from the most unexpected places. The Academy, at Captain Rostova's insistence, commissioned a small, discreet display case to be placed in the main library. It didn't hold a trophy or a plaque. It held a simple, worn canvas roll, unfurled to show a collection of oddly shaped surgical tools and a heavy brass navigational instrument. The plaque beneath it did not list her name or her accomplishments. It said only, "The tools are only as good as the hands that wield them." Competence is quiet. Miller's journey was perhaps the most profound ripple effect of all. Under Thorne's tutelage, he was unmade and then remade. The loud, brittle arrogance was stripped away, replaced by a quiet, focused intensity. He learned that leadership was not about being the loudest voice in the room, but about being the calmest mind in the crisis. A new batch of lieutenants, fresh from West Point, arrived full of piss and vinegar, their uniforms too new, their confidence unearned. One of them began to mock a local interpreter, an old man with a quiet demeanor and worn clothes. Miller overheard it. He didn't shout. He didn't pull rank. He walked over, put a hand on the young lieutenant's shoulder, and said quietly, "Son, let me tell you a story about a woman named Thorne and a bag full of old tools." The act of storytelling became the perpetuation of her legacy. Thorne herself, of course, was long gone. Her assessment complete, she had vanished as quietly as she had arrived. One day, she was there, observing a class on armored tactics. The next, her room was empty, her presence erased from the Academy's records as if she had never been. No one knew where she went. Some said she was retired. Others whispered she was in the field again, a ghost on a new frontier. But she had left something powerful behind. She had planted a seed of doubt in the fertile ground of institutional arrogance. The doubt that makes a person pause before they judge. The doubt that encourages them to look deeper, to listen harder. She had taught West Point that the most important lessons are not always found in the curriculum. Sometimes they are found in the quiet resilience of a single individual who proves, through action alone, that respect is not a right of rank, but a tribute earned through undeniable competence. Her legacy was not a statue or a name on a building. It was a change in the way a generation of officers thought. It was a quiet voice in the back of their minds, forever reminding them to look past the surface and to honor the silent professionals who do the real work of the world. Years melted into a decade. The story of the Weaver of West Point had solidified from a recent event into a core piece of the Academy's identity, as much a part of its culture as the long gray line itself. New cadets, known as plebes, were told the story during their first week of Beast Barracks, the grueling summer training that forged them into cadets. It was delivered not as a scolding, but as a foundational principle. An old, grizzled command sergeant major, his face a roadmap of a long and difficult career, would gather them in a darkened lecture hall. He would stand before them, not at a podium, but among them, his voice low and intimate. He would tell them about a woman who came with nothing but skill, who endured the mockery of the arrogant, and who, when the moment of crisis arrived, proved that character was more valuable than any piece of equipment. He would tell them about Cadet Miller, not as a villain, but as a cautionary tale of redemption, a man who learned the hard way that true strength is found in humility. "Look around you," the sergeant major would say, his voice resonating in the quiet hall. "In this room is someone who doesn't look the part, someone who is quiet, someone you might be tempted to overlook. Find that person. Learn from them, because they're the ones who will save you when the comms go dead and the maps are worthless." The lesson had taken root. A subtle but powerful shift had occurred. Cadets began to value different things. They still prized physical fitness and academic excellence, but a new respect grew for the quiet ones, the methodical thinkers, the cadets who were always observing, always learning. Study groups formed around esoteric subjects like celestial navigation and field expedient medicine. A culture of quiet competence began to emerge, a direct counterpoint to the chest-thumping bravado that had once defined the Academy's social hierarchy. The brass declinometer and the canvas roll of surgical tools remained in their glass case in the library. They had become a pilgrimage site. Cadets would stand before it before big exams or grueling field exercises, not as if praying to a holy relic, but as a way of centering themselves, of reminding themselves of the true standard of excellence. They were touching a piece of a legend, drawing strength from the story of a woman whose name most of them never even knew. They simply called her the specialist. Her act had become more than just a single event. It had become an enduring principle, a moral compass for the entire institution. It was a living testament to the idea that a legacy is not a static monument you leave behind, but an active, evolving force that continues to shape the future. The real triumph of Alara Thorne was not saving one cadet's life on a stormy afternoon. It was in altering the moral DNA of the very institution designed to produce America's future leaders. She had proven that one person, armed with nothing but unassailable skill and profound humility, could challenge a system, and in doing so, make it better, stronger, and wiser. Her silence had echoed through the years, becoming a guiding principle for thousands who would follow. The ultimate legacy of Alara Thorne was not written in any official history or after-action report. It was written in the lives of the officers who carried her lesson out into the world. It was in then Major Miller, years later, refusing to authorize a drone strike on a village because his quiet, unassuming local informant, a man everyone else dismissed as an old farmer, insisted there were children in the target building. He had learned to trust the quiet voice of experience over the loud certainty of technology. It was in a young captain, a woman who had been a terrified plebe listening to the sergeant major's story, who found herself stranded with her platoon after an IED disabled their vehicles. While her subordinates panicked, She calmly pulled out a star chart she had learned to make from Thorne's legend and guided them 20 miles through hostile territory to safety. The story had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. By teaching cadets to look for and value the quiet professional, the Academy began to produce more of them. Thorne's single act of competence had created a virtuous cycle, a ripple effect of humility and respect that spread from the hallowed grounds of West Point to the most dangerous and forgotten corners of the globe. Her true worth was never measured in the medals she was awarded or the classified mission she completed. It was measured in the lives saved by the people she inspired, in the bad decisions averted by the officers who remembered her story. It was a legacy not of destruction, but of preservation, not of ego, but of service. True legacy isn't what you leave behind in a display case. It's what continues to move forward in the hearts and minds of others. It's the quiet resolve in a leader's eyes during a crisis, the patience of a mentor teaching a difficult skill, the humility to admit you don't have all the answers. Alara Thorne had come to West Point to assess its training, but she had ended up teaching its soul. She had held up a mirror to the institution and forced it to see the difference between the illusion of strength and its reality. The illusion is loud, arrogant, and brittle. The reality is quiet, humble, and unbreakable. It is the steady hand in the storm, the calm voice in the chaos, the silent, unwavering competence that needs no applause, no recognition, no reward, save for the work itself. That is the ultimate currency of the quiet professional. It is a wealth that cannot be counted, only earned. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where true character defines a person's worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Stories.